Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We are beginning to discuss a new book this week by Cardinal Zen, For Love of My People, I Will Not Remain Silent. Very important subtitle on the situation of the church in China. This is Father Fessio speaking to you from the offices of Ignatius Press, Vivian Dudro from her kitchen in San Francisco, and Joseph Pierce from South Carolina. This is a small book. It's actually a series of lectures he gave on the anniversary of Pope Benedict's letter to China. I think, the word historic is overused, but I do think that what we're talking about in this book is historic. That is to say, it has to do with China and the church and China and the world. And if we look at the world geopolitically, there are obviously certain centers of influence and power, especially economic and political power. The United States is, of course, probably the top of the list. Russia is kind of a declining superpower with a lot of military might, however. Iran in the Middle East is a very powerful player, but China is certainly right up there at the top, both politically, economically, and culturally in its influence, and it's growing. So in the political map, China is something we should all know something about. On the religious map, apart from being 20% of the world's population, there are a lot of Christians and a lot of Catholics in China. And if you look at, who knows how our Lord looks at the globe, I suspect he sees Africa as a vital place of growth. But China is a tremendous missionary field. In Asia, we have different responses to Christ. It's odd how this happens kind of culturally, but in Japan, it seems like it's always been resistant to Christian evangelization. South Korea, on the other hand, has been quite receptive. And I put China closer to South Korea than to Japan. And I believe part of that's because of the Confucian Lao Tzu tradition of morality in China, which is a great pre-evangelization. So this whole thing about China is very important. And of course, it's run by a communist one-party system. And the relationship between the church and China as a political entity is a delicate one. Cardinal Zen, of course, is uniquely, well, maybe not uniquely, but very much qualified to speak on this because of his age and experience. But before we get into the book, Vivian or Joseph, you want to say any more about the general context of this book?
Well, in addition to being about China and its relationship to the church, there's also a lot of Vatican intrigue in this book.
Oh, my. Oh.
So
Yes.
You're getting a little lens into inner church politics as well.
Yeah, and I would also say, just to add to Father's points about China's role in the modern world, that we live at the moment, as regards American politics, in what I call the Democrat-plutocrat alliance. And we live in really strange days where you have a quasi-socialist Democratic Party in league with the largest global corporations, the largest big tech corporations, and the largest communist party in the world. And so you have this sort of capitalist communist alliance going on, which is really changing the ballgame. We could say more about that, but clearly China is a major player here, and the intolerance that the Chinese Communist Party shows towards Christians is the sort of direction that secularist governments in the so-called non-communist world, including our own country, seem to be moving towards. So, what's happening in China today could be what's happening here tomorrow. So we can't afford to be thinking, well, that's the other side of the world. we don't really have to worry about that. No, really, it could be the sign of things to come if we don't listen to Cardinal Zen and learn the lessons.
Well, you look at the new Silk Road, where China is having tremendous investments now, all the way from China to Italy, and then in South America and in Africa, enormous Chinese investments and influence there. So they desire to be a world power of influence, and they're probably going to be no matter what, because of the population and because of the great talents of many of the Chinese people. So we can't be provincial in looking just about what's happening around us, but China is important. Also, I didn't mention it, but this book is really centered on the letter that Pope Benedict XVI wrote to China. And that, I think, is a document which, again, has historic implications and will continue to do so for some time in the future. I note on page 7 in the introduction by Aurelio Porfiri, a good friend of Cardinal Zen's, he says, these are lectures delivered in Hong Kong. I wonder if today those lectures could be delivered in Hong Kong. I doubt it. Yeah. And he's writing on the 10th anniversary of Pope Benedict's letter to the Church in the People's Republic of China. So this is a very important book, really.
It's also important to note, I think, Father, that this book was written and published, well, the lectures were given and the book was published before the agreement, the so-called secret agreement between the Vatican and the Chinese government was signed. And so that's kind of important to know, that all this was happening beginning in pontificates before that of Francis. These talks and this trying to understand the situation and figure out how to respond was going on, and Pope Benedict played a key role in that prior to the agreement that was settled upon during Francis's pontificate.
Exactly, and therefore this book is not a reaction to that at all, but rather a more general comment on the relations between the Church and China. And that agreement, by the way, is called the Provisional Agreement, because it was not meant to be a final agreement, and it is still secret. The contents of that agreement are still not known, which is an issue in itself about how Catholics are supposed to respond to it. Well, shall we jump into it then? Chapter 1?
Yeah. Well, I have page 12, if that doesn't.
All right.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the fact that Cardinal Zen says right at the beginning here about Pope Benedict XVI, that he is qualified through his own experience of totalitarian regimes to understand the issues in China. Unlike, to quote Cardinal Zen, high-ranking Vatican officials, most of whom are Italian, who have not lived under such a totalitarian regime, their concept of it is somewhat naive and optimistic. So I think that we are dealing with naivete and optimism. I also think, however, and quite frankly, we're dealing with corruption. And the Chinese government is corrupt and it has an awful lot of money. And I would not be the least bit surprised if some of the key political players in the Curia are in the pay of China, to be quite frank about it.
We need to add also, Joseph, that at the time of these talks, Cardinal Zen was talking about the Italian high-ranking Vatican officials, and now during Francis's pontificate, we have plenty of Latin American high-ranking officials. And like the Italians, the Latin American clergy have a very different history of communism than the Chinese do now, and the Soviets. And so they do, I would put the Latin Americans in the same boat of having this kind of naive optimism about communism.
Until communists gain power, they are the voice of justice, in inverted commas, against corruption. Now, all governments are corrupt. So, until you actually have a communist government in place to see what it is in practice, they are the voice of the opposition against corruption. There's always going to be this sense of, well, that makes a lot of sense. But you've got to realize where these people are coming from and where do they always end if you actually give them power.
Right. I attended a lecture in Rome, this was many years ago, by an Italian economist. And he was talking about, there's a big difference between Italian communism and Chinese communism, I mean, there's no way Italians are going to run around wearing the same pajamas.
Well, they did run around wearing the same black shirts for about 20 years, but that's another matter.
but still, there are these cultural differences, and they do matter.
Well, this first lecture is kind of a prehistory of Benedict's letter. And at that time, the head of the Congregation for the Evangelization of People was Cardinal Tomko, who was a cardinal from a former communist country, and therefore who also was quite aware of, being careful in dealing with communist officials. And so I think that Cardinal Tomko and Cardinal Zen got along quite well and understood each other, and also the risks that were always present in dealing with communist governments.
I would say as well, Father, that I did find it very helpful, and it may be worth just reiterating here quickly, because I'm not an expert on Chinese history, and I suspect most of people that are tuned in here are not either. And he gives Justine about 2 sentences, just the background. So the Communist Party took power in China in 1949, just after World War II. The Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association was established by the communists in 1957. And the following year, it began ordaining bishops. So again, you have a state-mandated quasi-Catholic religion ordaining bishops without a mandate from the Holy See. And then you have the years of the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, which sought to wipe out religion altogether, where even the official church was obliterated. And then you only had the underground church. And then as the bamboo curtain softened, shall we say, and the Chinese started to be in league with the global corporations, then we have the reemergence of the state church, the state-approved church. And then you have 2 churches: the underground church that was forced underground during the Cultural Revolution and has stayed underground, and this church which is above the surface but also largely controlled by the government.
And the underground church, made up of people who really risked their lives to remain faithful, whether they were laymen and laywomen, or whether they were also especially bishops and priests. And so Cardinal Zen has a great love and concern for those who suffered under so many hardships, that they not be abandoned and betrayed. That's a key point for him.
Especially if you realize that during the Cultural Revolution, I mean, Mao was even more brutal than Stalin in terms of the body count. So to be a Catholic during the years of the Cultural Revolution was absolute heroism, and many, of course, were killed. So of course we have a duty to loyalty towards those people.
I found it so interesting on page 18 where
Yes.
where Cardinal Zen is talking about the seminarians, the concern about seminarians being trained in the communist-controlled above-ground seminaries, and how Cardinal Tomko, whom you mentioned, Father, being Czechoslovakian and also well acquainted with communist dictatorships, he told Cardinal Zen that it was his experience that priests trained in the seminaries under control of the communists are the most rebellious against the communist government. It means that the Lord is enlightening them. I don't know about you, but I took great comfort by that line.
I did too, and I underlined that, and I put an exclamation point next to it. Because the context there was that because the official church did not have the infrastructure, so to speak, or the faculties to teach seminarians, they went to the underground church for help, these bishops. And there was a question, well, should we help? And Cardinal Zen was one of the ones who, before he was cardinal, he was a priest. He actually went into the official patriotic church seminaries to teach. And this was, one of the reasons for doing so. What Cardinal Tomquist said is that don't worry about that. Those, if you send your underground seminarians to the Patriotic Church Seminary, they're going to be the ones that are going to rebel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was a good point. Anything else on this first lecture?
Well, I think that the other fact we need to see here that the CDF under Cardinal Ratzinger said that these bishops ordained by the state church are illegitimate, but they are valid. So there's no question about the priests not being validly ordained. So that's an important fact, because in the parallel situation, the Anglican Church, that the Anglican clergy were not validly ordained, and at that point you've got a complete mess and a discontinuum. So we don't have a discontinuum here. We have a political situation that needs to be resolved.
Yes, that's a very important point. I think also what comes up, this need when you're working toward agreements, to recognize how important it is for the Chinese not to lose face. That comes up a couple of times, sort of implicitly here. And I don't know, that's an important thing for Americans to know, I think, in dealing with China as well. That, anyway, just throw that out there for fun.
You mean to say that the Chinese are like American bishops?
Well, the irony I've got on page 20 onwards is that the thing about the year 2000, an illegitimate ordination attempt and a canonization protest. The protest by the Chinese government, in order not to lose face, was that basically Catholicism was imperialist, right? That, this sort of Western idea coming in. And the absolutely delightful, divinely comic irony is, where did Karl Marx come from? Right? If you talk about imperialism, right? Talk about a whole country being hoodwinked by Western imperialism in taking up Marxism. I mean, what are they talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Joseph. Of course, that charge of imperialism is exactly what the Vietnamese used to slaughter Catholics there also, even before communism, right? And Father, you mentioned, about the Japanese resistance to Christianity. And even under the shoguns, it was this idea that this is a foreign alien thing coming into our society. It has no place here.
But there's a difference between a xenophobic nationalism, which is one of the reasons that the church has not taken deep root in Japan, and a Western imperialism born of the Enlightenment, which goes on about colonization and imperialism. In other words, that the Chinese have succumbed to Western imperialism in embracing Karl Marx. Now, that's a bit different from the Japanese saying, well, what has this alien religion got to do with Japan?
With us,
right?
Yeah.
So, they're both enemies of the church, but I think coming from different directions.
Well, but they'll accept everything else from the West, our money, reserve currency, the language we use, our computers, our technological developments, and everything. Just not the church.
They can't take anything that has an authority higher than themselves.
Okay.
A total state, by definition, has total power. And if anything has anything above that can judge that, hold it accountable to some other standard, then totalitarian systems cannot tolerate that.
But then how can you explain Korea, especially, what's now South Korea, even before there were missionaries that went there, they got a copy of the Gospels of the Bible, and they asked for missionaries. And Korea was begging for missionaries to come before there was even anybody there.
I think that Korea, though, did have its share of martyrs, did it not?
Well, eventually it did, yeah. But at the beginning, they really they welcomed Christianity.
Right. So,
go ahead.
Yeah.
I want to make a point here. You mentioned this interesting thread going through these lectures of Vatican intrigue. On page 2728, Cardinal Zen reflects upon the new prefect of the CEP, the Congregation of Evangelization of Peoples. And he's having this conversation, and the new prefect tells Zen here on 28, He told me, Cardinal Zen, don't forget that communists are also our brothers. Our Lord died on the cross for them. And I replied, but Your Eminence, do you think I do not believe in what you are saying? However, if the communists are my brothers, so are the bishops that they jail. On which side should I stand? Then he ended the conversation by saying, there are many things that we can do, but you cannot, says the Vatican official. In short, he wanted me to stay out of it. My answer was, yes, you can make more mistakes. We can.
It's excellent. And actually, at the beginning of that section, Father, going back 2 pages, difficult beginning for the pontificate of Pope Benedict. It says, among curie officials, Benedict was not considered, quote, one of them. I can't think of A, a better compliment to Pope Benedict, and B, a better qualification for Pope.
On the other hand, I used to spend a lot of time in Rome. Not in large chunks, but quite frequently. And I have to say that the people I met, the curial officials at every level, top to bottom, were by and large from every country, Italians, non-Italians. They were good, prayerful, serious Catholics, hardworking. And so there's a lot of good people in the Curia. However, the ones that get the attention or in the media are the ones that do not belong to that class. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy to make it clear, because I've said something about bishops, that when we talk about the bishops, obviously mea culpa if I'm taken to suggest that someone is ipso facto bad because they're a bishop. Right? Heaven forbid. I mean, I know many good bishops, and thanks be to God, there are many good and holy and courageous bishops. The problem is that the weakest link, in other words, the weakest bishops, seem to be the ones that call the shots, at least at the moment, and that includes the Curia.
It's the same old problem. How do you get the philosophers to be kings?
Right.
Very old problem.
Even more difficult. How do you get the saints to be kings?
Yes. Well, in fact, doesn't someone say about Benedict? It's in here about him being basically too good.
That's the end of the next chapter, I think.
Is it?
Page 48, yeah. 46. He says, "Why?" Top of the page there. Why did the Holy Father not speak out himself? Pope Benedict is a saint, a great theologian, but he has a weakness. He is too good, too humble, too tolerant.
Right. I would merely state there, however, that obviously you can't be too good and you can't be too humble, but you can be too tolerant. And the final sentence of that chapter, and we've jumped ahead, I know, but when he quotes Pope Benedict saying, "What is going on?" He replied, "Sometimes one does not want to offend a person." And you've heard me, perhaps, because I'm saying it all the time, an act of self-deprecation against my own people when I say that the English at the time of the Reformation threw out the 10 Commandments, and we kept just one: "Thou shalt not be impolite." Right? Thou shalt not offend anybody. Right? And that's not a virtue.
Yes. Let's move on to chapter 2, or the second lecture, events shortly before and after the letter. And incidentally, not so incidentally, actually, in this book, the Cardinal is going to give a very close reading of this letter in 3 full chapters and 3 full lectures. And I think that's important. I think we should all know the contents of this letter, because they really set out what should be the relationship between the Church and the People's Republic of China. There's more. This chapter has more what I would call the deep church, compared to the deep state.
There is a sentence by Cardinal Zen here, which I'm going to say it and then to reiterate what I said just now. This middle of page 43. The Curia has always tried to please the Chinese government, That's a sweeping statement, and taking on board what you said, Father, about there being many, many good members of the Curia. I think, as a rule, that would be borne out by fact. Is that the Curia, at least in the last 30 years or so, has always tried to please the Chinese government, and that is an issue. And if I've just finished writing a book on English history for Ignatius Press, and I do see parallels here between this situation and the English Reformation under Queen Elizabeth. And Pope Saint Pius V was criticised and condemned for excommunicating Queen Elizabeth I on the basis that's only going to increase the persecution of the Catholics in England, which is true, it did. But if St. Pius V, first of all, had done nothing after the butchery following the Northern Rebellion, that would have been a sin of omission. But secondly, the English Catholics didn't know what they were allowed to do. Was the Anglican Church sort of Catholic? Could they go to the state religion? Was it bona fide or was it not? And St. Pius V made it clear so that Catholics knew exactly what the teaching of the church was, what the magisterium was, and it allowed them to make decisions, and it led to the martyrs. And I don't regret the martyrs. I don't think the martyrs regret the martyrs. They're in heaven. So I think this is the scenario we have here. Are we worried about getting the Chinese government angry? No, we shouldn't be. We should be about teaching the truth and preaching the truth, and if necessary, embracing the martyrs.
Isn't there a line in here somewhere about secretariats of state have a tendency to want to please governments in general in the Vatican? And so that's why we need these other players. You could be playing at different methods all at the same time, right? And so, but you can tell that Cardinal Zen's frustration is with, the side that errs too much on diplomacy and pleasing and so on, and not enough about the truth, as you point out, Joseph.
The path of least resistance leads to hell. And I think that's the danger that we find ourselves in.
Well, Father Mankowski, in a book that we'll be publishing soon, talks about when there's problems or inside the church, you have kind of two groups. He calls them the nutritionists and the surgeons. And the nutritionists say, "Well, look, let's just give them a little more exercise, a little more food, some vitamin supplements, and they'll all get better." And the surgeons say, "Look, cut this thing out before it ruins the whole body, And at different times in the church, one of those sides can be better than the other. Joseph, you and I tend to be more on the surgical team, and Cardinal Zen as well.
There's no point nourishing a cancer, Father.
Well, that's exactly right, but it may not be a cancer, you see. So I think what you're saying, Vivian, is that to a certain extent, it's good to have this tension in the church. We need kind of it's like in the for marriage dissolution, they've got defender of the bond. They've always got someone who's going to defend the bond of marriage to oppose the arguments of those who are trying to dissolve the bond. But that way, you can make sure all sides are heard. But the tendency, I think, in Roman Curia is too much toward diplomacy. That's right. Right.
And then you've got this whole issue of, these cloak and dagger translators.
Yes.
Which, Father, I know you've dealt with that in the past. Who's messing with these translations?
Well, and in this chapter, in this lecture, he talks about the Pope Benedict kind of reconstituting these meetings that were had under John Paul II with Cardinal Tomko, where in preparation for writing this letter, Pope Benedict intentionally brought into the room not just the diplomats from the Vatican, but people from China and elsewhere and experts on this, and he actually listened to them. But then on page 32, there's a heading, 3 things discussed at the meeting. And there are 3 things the people at the meeting agreed on, more or less. But he says at the bottom of the section on page 34, however, not heeding the 3 decisions made by the committee is a sign of little respect on the part of the Roman Curia for the participants in this important meeting. So the Curia tends to filter what gets to the Pope. In fact, on page 35, when the Secretary of State says, quote, "The Pope's letter has been definitively approved," and Carlos says, "What do you mean approved? By whom? It's the Pope's letter, right?" But what happens is that these subalterns, they draft these things and they make the changes and so on. And then when it's approved, they feel that their letter has been approved. Well, wait a minute. This is the Pope's letter. You're supposed to just be giving him some advice on it.
But haven't we seen this in so many other papal documents? You'll be going along reading something presumably written by a Pope John Paul II or a Benedict XVI. And we know what their voice sounds like, and you're reading along, and all of a sudden you come across this diplomatic, sociological, gobbledygooky, whatever it is, the same old boilerplate that gets inserted into these other documents every time. And you right away say, these are the subalterns doing their mischief right here, putting in this stuff that's, anyway.
Well, here's an example, page 37, because, Cardinal Zen was pretty upset with these bishops who took part in ordinations of illegitimate, bishops. And towards the top of the page, in the letter, Benedict said that, quote, "Some in special situations under pressure have accepted to be illegitimately ordained." That is, the priests allow ordination. Well, there's a gloss put on that letter, attached to the document, saying, quote, "Some, caring for the good of the faithful and looking far into the future, have accepted to be illegitimately ordained." And so, talk about a spin.
Yep.
Say, well, those who didn't accept to be illegitimately ordained were not caring for the good of the faithful and not looking far into the future. I mean,
and you know what? This boilerplate stuff that you see over and over again, it almost always has a time-conditioned reference to it. Meaning looking into the future.
Oh, yeah.
Better.
It's the worship of the future. It's the worship of the future, right? I mean, obviously, those who are on the side of the Chinese Communist government are on the side of history, right? On the right side of history. Those who are resisting the Communist government are on the wrong side of history. It's the progressive dogma.
Which you, Joseph, point out in almost every book discussion, and here it is again. These people who meddled with this document had to put in something about this beautiful future we all are just waiting for.
Heaven on earth. It's going to come, brother.
Yes. And so, but this, as you mentioned, Vivian, this translation question, we see right here what happens in Rome so often. That it happened with the liturgy. It happened with the missal itself. They are going to get their ideology embedded in church documents, one way or the other. Either in the preparation of documents, they'll filter out what they don't like and propose what they do like, and then once it is there on the translation, they'll fudge the translation. Not good.
Put in the one word that poisons with ambiguity, for instance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it even happened to some extent in the Second Vatican Council, that there were compromises made with the understanding that if we leave this somewhat ambiguous, then we can get our own meaning out of it later on.
Don't you think that's most obvious in Gaudium et Spes?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, good. I think we've got a good start on this book, and we'll continue with the next 3 chapters or 3 lectures, 3, 4, and 5 next week. Unless any closing comments, Joseph or Vivian?
Not for me.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we'll hope to see you next week. God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.